Hashtag the Reubenite waits in the gate of the tabernacle courtyard holding the altar of his bullock, waiting for the priest to come to help him sacrifice it. The scent of burning meat and fresh blood waft past him. The priest is very busy this day, this feast, this first high day of the Feast of Tabernacles, 2017 BCE. Hashtag notices a sweat on the priest's face as he goes up and down the ramp of the altar of burnt offering, stoking the fires, heating up, and sacrificing bullocks, rams, lambs, goats, along with pouring drink offerings and splashing blood against the altar as the law demanded. The scene will go on daily, and especially during each of Yahweh's feasts. It's a time of very busy sacrifice for the priests. The law had said, "These are the feasts of Yahweh, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations," holy comings together, calling out, to offer an offering made by fire unto Yahweh, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations to, and a burnt offering, he says, and a meat offering, a sacrifice, and drink offerings, everything upon his day, Leviticus 23:37. There was never any question that Hashdad and his family would be there at the feast. In fact, all Israel was there. There was no question whether they would stay home, whether they'd sit in their tent. They would sacrifice on that day. The scene shifts to early October 2017. Bible student William Go, he prefers to be called Willie. Willie Go passes the office water cooler, listening to the latest trivia. Co-workers telling off-color jokes and talk of their next weekend bash. But his mind is not on the frivolous. Something gnaws at Willie Go. While studying the past Sabbath, he was struck by what the Apostle Paul said in Acts 18:21. And what really shook him was the resoluteness of which Paul made this statement: "I must by all means keep this feast that comes in Jerusalem." That sure didn't sound like if Paul was unsure about going to the feast. It didn't sound like he considered feast observance optional or done away at the cross. Paul was steadfast to keep the feast. Even after this time, Yahshua had ascended to heaven. I know I should go to the Feast of Tabernacles too, Willie Go argues with himself, but if I do, I'll miss a paycheck. And I don't know what my boss will say, not to mention my unbaptized wife. I don't really have the funds to travel. Besides, the car isn't running very well. It needs tires. It needs a tune-up. And there's just so many things that would have to be taken care of. While trying to talk himself out of the tabernacle observance, Willie was nagged by the clear and unmistakable command in Leviticus to observe the time by none other than the one he worships, Almighty Yahweh. How can I look Yahweh in the face if I don't do what he tells me to do? How can I ignore his mandate to keep his feast, he asked himself. On the other hand, I'm having so many problems. It's just one after another after another. I don't know what to do now. After weighing the cost of the sacrifice, Willie decides he just can't go to the feast. Instead, he goes to work. And the entire week is misery. His conscience hammers at him the whole time. Nothing goes right the whole time. He feels sick about staying at home. In determination, Willie Go promises himself and Yahweh, "I will go next year to Yahweh's feast." Two scenes, one ancient and one just yesterday. The one thing common to both is Yahweh's clear command to come before him, to keep his Feast of Tabernacles, and in both there is sacrifice. So let's get the graphic up there. Sorry about that. Sacrifice. Sacrifice? Absolutely. No, we aren't throwing animals up on an altar to burn as a sacrifice, offering to Yahweh. Since Joshua came, Yahweh doesn't want that right now. But still there is sacrifice in obeying Yahweh. Sacrifice of time, sacrifice of finances. So other pursuits are sacrificed, like personal relationships maybe, but just not the animal kind. Samuel contrasted the concept of sacrifice by asking in 1 Samuel 15:22, has Yahweh as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of Yahweh? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. Sacrifice Yahweh wants is obedience, obeying him in all ways. And there are many ways we must obey him. It's not always easy, just as the sacrifice that you have had to come today. All right, so on behalf of Yahweh's Restoration Ministry, we welcome you all. Glad to have you here, and I extend a warm welcome to everyone who has sacrificed to come out. We're blessed to see your dedication and are thrilled that you made Tabernacles 2017 a blessing for you and us. You may know this is our first feast here at these facilities, and it was as we hit the ground running after October of last year and started planning and moving and getting things to go, for the feast, for the year to come. It really was kind of a blessing to kind of be able to look out and say, well, how are we going to do this? How are we going to do that? Well, we can do this and that, and a lot of planning went in it. Randy, Ryan, the others are planning the facilities every day, it seems, working with the people who would get involved. So anyway, we finally got here. We're not perfect, as you probably know. We still got some way to go on getting things the way we want them, but that's a part of sacrifice too for Yahweh, and we're glad that you're here. We have those here who have never kept a feast before. We have those here who have never kept a feast with us before. We have those who have kept many feasts before. With brethren, this happens to be my 50th. Back in 1968, my first feast, I'll never forget it. You'll never forget your first feast. You'll remember the experiences you had and those you met, and they'll always be in your mind. I talked to a brother, Chester. He said, this is 49th. My wife's 49th. My sister's 49th. It becomes the highlight of your life to keep tabernacles. It really does. And once you get into Yahweh's way, it's something you'll always want to do. You'll always remember the joys of his days. So, after much planning and preparation, we're here to rejoice, as Yahweh commanded at the feast. We don't want to see any gloomy faces. We don't want to see any Debbie Downers. Sorry, Debbie's not just an expression, Wow. The command is in Leviticus 23:40, and you shall take you on the first day the boughs of goodly trees, branches of palm trees, and the boughs of thick trees and willows of the brook. You shall rejoice before Yahweh your Elohim 7 days. We've all come out of the world for an amazing time, to fellowship, to do so much at this feast, to interact with each other and learn things from each other. Learn the experiences others have had. Kind of build on that repertoire that you'll have in the years to come, and the things that people have said and told you and what they've been through. Do you know you can change your mood just by smiling? You actually can. Science studies have shown that your emotions react to your physical posture. Why should we be joyful? Well, for the promise of salvation, for one thing. The voice of rejoicing and salvation is in the tabernacles of the righteous, Psalm 118:15. What better reason to be glad? Think about it. We're here because of our desire one day to be in the kingdom, to serve Yahshua as a kingdom of priests. That lies at the root of everything we do every day, every thought hinges on that and our faith and what drives what we do here to be a servant of Yahweh, to receive that crown that James 1 and Revelation 2 talk about. And that's what Feast of Tabernacles pictures, the kingdom, the coming kingdom of Yahweh on earth. So we try to make it much as we can in our weak efforts here as human beings to be a part and like the kingdom. That itself is reason enough to be here, observing this feast with joy. And here we gather for a week with others of the same mind, have gone through the same trials, have the same faith. You're not going to find that out in the world very, very much, and have their hearts focused on Yahweh. We come out in a physical sense because the Tabernacles is a pilgrim feast where you go and observe the observance. Israel couldn't keep a feast in Egypt, a sinful place. They had to go to the wilderness to tabernacle. Yahweh did not have in mind a resort or a hotel or something in the middle of a metropolis somewhere. When he said, come out, keep my feast in the wilderness, that's what he meant. So it just happens that we're in a wilderness setting here at the home office, so it's working out pretty well, and we're glad for it. And that is why we seek Yahweh as we come before him. You can't experience the promised land by dragging Egypt with you. Tabernacle, the word is mishkan in the Hebrew, meaning a residence, a dwelling place. We're here at the Feast of Dwelling Places. Another Hebrew word for tabernacle is ohel, meaning a tent, a dwelling, a habitation. So we come out here to live. I remember my wife was reminding me of our first several feasts, and she said, I just couldn't understand. Our family couldn't get it. Why don't you just stay in your house? Why do you get in a tent? You know, I know it's very warm in October. It happened to be here, but it's going to cool off, they say. But anyway, why do you do that? Go to a tent. Because we're keeping the feast of dwellings, special dwellings. Another, the scripture speaks of the Feast of Tabernacles. It's the word sukkah, which is synonymous with mishkan and ohel. And it means a booth, a cottage, a hut of entwined boughs. So it's a special dwelling place. It's not your normal place of dwelling. The implicit meaning in all of these terms is temporary living place. We live here temporarily. It's in the design of the tabernacle that Yahweh chose to interrelate with Israel in the wilderness. It tells us that we're just temporary here on earth. We're looking for something greater, a kingdom that will one day make this look like nothing when we get to that kingdom. We'll talk about kingdom at the end of the feast. We've got a message prepared for that. But, when you look into the scriptures in Revelation, find out just how magnificent that kingdom is going to be. It just blows your mind. We'll look back on this and say, man, a little bit of sacrifice I did for this? Unbelievable. The only way you can know Yahweh correctly is to practice the one and only way of worship that he commands. That's the only way. There's only one way. One faith, one hope, one baptism, Ephesians tells us. Only one way, not through different religions, all roads lead to the kingdom. Not true. There's only one way, and he says that over and over and over. Israel had to learn one way, and if you wanted to be in that way, you had to become a part of Israel, because that's where the covenant was, with Israel. Clearly in his instruction manual, it's unmistakable that Yahweh expects total fidelity and devotion to him. We may sometimes fall short, but this is what he expects. So we repent, we apologize, and we go on in that way. This is what he wants of his true worshipers. We learn of Yahweh through the teaching and observing of his feast days. Turn to Ezekiel chapter 20, if you got your scriptures. I don't have these on the board. But Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 10. In this chapter, Yahweh desired to be intimately personal Father. But he found instead a rebellious Israel. Wherefore I caused them to go forth out of the land of Egypt and brought them into the wilderness. Verse 11, I gave them my statutes and showed them my judgments, which if a man do, he shall live in them. It becomes a part of your life. It's part of your DNA. There's no question where, well, do we really have to? Oh, yeah, it's part of you now. His precepts become a part of life for the believer, and there's no question that the believer will observe them as he is told in the scriptures until his last breath. The feasts are woven into existence itself for man. Moreover, I also gave them my Sabbaths to be a sign between me and them. What is the one commandment? It is a sign. It's the Sabbath. How important is that? Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. It's a sign between Yahweh's people and him. You don't keep the Sabbath, there's no sign between you and Yahweh. He doesn't recognize you fully. He may call you later, and that's great, but at that point, you're not in the same realm, basically. That they might know that I am Yahweh that sanctified them. The Sabbath, and that's plural, that means more than just the weekly Sabbath, includes not just once a year. There's 7 of them throughout the year. The term Sabbath is a metaphor for feasts in the scriptures. The Moedim. Moedim connotes assembling. Appointed times. I learned that word means feet. Feet that travel. It's not just something on a calendar. It's the feet that travel, to go. And if you look at Israel, and if you look at the Hebrew as opposed to the Greek, very fascinating. We're going to have a little bit of a seminar on that. Hebrew is an action, a feeling language. Greek is an analytical language. Paul's on Areopagus, and he's walking around, and all these professors are up there, and they're talking about the latest philosophy, the latest idea, just sitting around their togas, doing nothing. And Paul goes up and he says, hey, over here, you have statues for all these different deities, but there's one that says to the unknown mighty one. We're gonna talk about that. I'm gonna tell you about him. Oh, there's something new. Your guy's got something new to talk about. Not they're gonna do anything about it, but he's got something new. Let's listen to him. And so they, he explains Yahweh, but that's just the point. It's action faith, not talking about it. It's action, it's doing, it's coming out as we have done now. So he said, I gave them these precepts, and they become part of the believer's life. And there's no question that you're going to be in those precepts and never give them up. He says, so that they might know that I am Yahweh, that sets them apart. Sanctify means set apart. The Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath, and here, Sabbath is a metaphor for feasts as well, which it is in Scripture. The Sabbaths were a sign, setting Israel apart anciently. Who said? Yahweh said himself. Okay, so we in the new covenant now want to be a part of Yahweh's family. Therefore, the New Testament believer asks, which Sabbath did Yahweh or Yahushua give to us so that we might know him, like Israel did? Answer, the same ones that were part of the foundational covenant that were kept anciently and are also now being observed in the new covenant. If you understand the covenants, they're the basis of everything as far as I'm concerned. The covenants are the promise Yahweh gave to his people. You do this, and I'll reward you with this, basically is what it was. So he gave them covenants to keep. And he gives them a whole bunch of laws to do that, so you know exactly how far to go and where not to go and what to do and what not to do and so forth. But they become a joy. I've heard, I don't know how many brethren say, I first started keeping the weekly Sabbath. It was kind of a burden. It was kind of tough because the world is contrary to everything, that a believer does or says, it seems. And so after a while, I really look forward to the Sabbath. Forced rest. Where are you going to get forced rest? There's nothing that anybody say, okay, now you come on out, you got to start doing this and that. Nope, I'm keeping the Sabbath. No work, no menial work. I'm keeping the Sabbath day. And that's such a, when you're locked into that, you look forward to the Sabbath. Especially when you had a busy week, or even when you don't have a busy week. It's still Yahweh's day, and he blesses you for it. Nowhere in the New Testament do we find any other Sabbaths or feasts given. Nowhere do we find that the Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, have ever been replaced by something else. It's not there. The same goes for Pentecost, which you find the apostles observing, of course, in Acts 2. And nothing to take the place of the Feast of Trumpets, Day of Atonement, Feast of Tabernacles. So what does Yahweh expect now? Nowhere from Matthew 1:1 through Revelation 22:1, that's the whole Bible, do we ever find anywhere in that text that the holy days that Israel was commanded to keep have been changed, replaced, modified, done away with by other holidays. In fact, over and over we find the apostles, as well as Yahshua himself, keeping these same days. To me, what better, what more solid evidence that they're important is Yahshua kept them, his apostles kept them because Yahshua taught them to keep them. And we're supposed to follow Yahshua as our elder teacher and brother and everything, that what he did, we would do. That's the whole thing. He patterned his life so that we would have a track to run on, so we can do the same thing. So if he's keeping them, why on earth would you say, no, I'm not going to? It's because you don't know. You don't know Yahweh. You don't know his son. Hopefully you'll find him. Hopefully you'll figure it out. But at this point, someone arguing that, they don't know him. Paul in Galatians 6:16 calls the New Covenant assembly the Israel of Yahweh. Israel of Yahweh. In 1 Corinthians 10, he says that Israel's promise are lessons for us. Israel is a pattern for us as they are commanded to do. He says what they did anciently is for us to learn from. 1 Corinthians 10. I want to read the first, 1 through 6. Moreover, brethren, I would not that you be ignorant how that all our fathers were under the cloud and all passed through the sea. And they were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and did all eat the same spiritual meat, and did all drink the same spiritual drink. They drank of that spiritual rock that followed, and that rock, and that's capital R, was Messiah. So here we have Yahshua as the rock in the Old Testament, leading them. But with many of them, Elohim was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things, verse 6, were our examples. There are examples to the intent that we should not lust after evil things and, do the things they did. So there is our example. How can we say, well, that's just Old Testament. That's just ancient Israel. And they're examples for us. That's right. That's what he said. The very one they say who has abolished and changed the whole system, the Apostle Paul said otherwise, didn't he? We're spiritual Israelites. If we're not physical, we're spiritual. We become part of Israel, not some radical new movement, that called the church, that has its own worship, developed from, 350, 360 of a common era. Doctrines that were developed through 20-some church councils when they hammered out what they're going to believe. Why don't they just go to the scriptures? We have people say, all the time, you know what? What you're saying, what you're teaching, I found out by myself in the Bible. The same thing, which to me is affirmation that we're teaching what Yahweh says in his word and not making anything up. If they can find the same thing with never even knowing we existed, to me that's a real message from Yahweh. He made a covenant with Abraham with promises that his seed would cover the earth like sands of the sea. And in his parable of Luke 13, Yahshua said, there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. When you see Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, interesting, what they did was acceptable because they're going to be in the kingdom. The precepts and statutes and judgments they followed are going to be acceptable, or they wouldn't be in the kingdom. And he says, when you see them in the kingdom, you yourself thrust out. Why? Because you decided, I'm going a different way. That's not for me. That's Israel. That's ancient stuff that's over and done. And you hear, it's so sad because you hear churches hammer this over and over and over and over. You get so tired of it, and it never ends. So people tell us, oh, that's just Old Testament. Yeah, it is Old Testament, and it's the basis of the faith. From there on, that's what Yahushua taught. He taught the Old Testament because he didn't have a New Testament to walk around with. King James wasn't even alive yet. Coverdale Bible wasn't there yet. Tyndale hadn't done any translation yet. All he had was the Old Testament. He didn't have Paul. He didn't have the apostles. They hadn't written yet. Some of them weren't even around at that point. But he says that those who are of faith are blessed along with faithful Abraham, Galatians 3:9. You're blessed along with Abraham, not in deference to Abraham, not aside from Abraham, but with Abraham. See, all of these things start to tie together. You start seeing the Old and New Testament merge and become as one. Oh yeah, there were some changes. We don't do animal sacrifices, but Yahshua explained that. He said, I'm the sacrifice now because I can take away sin, not just cover it up. Like an animal could only animals can't take away sin, we read. Yahshua said, I take it away. But that he didn't say I didn't take away the feast days, I didn't take away the Sabbath. He kept those things. We see it over and over. Paul goes to Macedonia, goes to some of the towns that he started his ministry, Philippi and all these others, Galatia and all of that, and Corinth up into the Greek area. What did he do? He went in on the Sabbath day. He didn't go in on Sunday. He went in on the Sabbath. He established assemblies, and then they worshiped on the Sabbath. And even the Gentiles came. They came the next week and the next week on the Sabbath. Why didn't he say, okay, guys, I know you're here, because the Jews keep the Sabbath. I know that's probably what you think, because I am a Jew, by the way, tribe of Benjamin. But tomorrow, or I should say next week, we'll be keeping Sunday. So don't bother coming here on Sabbath. We're going to be keeping Sunday. He never said that. The next week they came on Sabbath. The week after they came on Sabbath. What was he doing? He was keeping the Sabbath as the law commanded. That's why. And he was teaching these people too when he started these assemblies all over Asia Minor. Anyway,